I am responding to the claim that the death penalty makes the United States a safe place to live. The opponent's secondary claims are that the death penalty deters people from committing horrendous crimes. Second, without the death penalty, law firms would lose jobs. And third, public opinion of the death penalty is still strong. On to the first point. The death penalty deters people from committing horrendous crimes. Now, the opponent gives the reason that the death penalty exists to prevent people from committing horrible crimes such as premeditated murder. Now, this may be true, but there is no evidence given that people are deterred from committing crimes by the death penalty. So without evidence, I find it hard to believe that people are deterred from the death penalty. So on the contrary, the death penalty fails as a deterrent because any punishment can be an effective deterrent only if it's consistently employed. Capital punishment cannot be administered to meet these conditions. According to the article, The Case Against the Death Penalty, written by Hugo Vidal, only a small proportion of first-degree murders are sentenced to death, and even fewer are executed. Hugo also says that although death sentences since 1980 have increased in number to about 250 per year, this is still only 1% of all homicides known to the police. And second, of all these convicted on a charge of criminal homicide, only 2% are eventually sentenced to death. And the possibility of increasing the number of convicted murders sentenced to death and executed by enacting mandatory death penalty laws was ruled unconstitutional by the Woodson and Carolina case in 1976. Furthermore, the death penalty is no more effective than imprisonment in deterring murder, and that it may even incite criminal violence in certain cases. The article displays this by 2 points. The death penalty states, as a group such as California, Florida, and Texas, do not have lower rates of criminal homicide than the non-death penalty rate states like New Mexico, Illinois, and New Jersey. The article states that during the 1980s, death penalty states averaged on an annual rate of 7.5 criminal homicides per 100,000 of the population, and states with without the death penalty averaged a rate of 7.4, so there's no difference. Use of the death penalty in a given state may increase the rate of criminal homicide in that state. For example, Hugo writes that in New York between 1907 and 1964, 692 executions were carried out. On average, over this 57-year period, one or more executions in a given month aided a net increase of 2 homicides to the total committed in the next month. According to Untitled.org, there are on average about 3,000 people that are eligible for the death penalty per year, but only 115 death sentences handed down, and only 45 which end up being executions. This makes the death penalty arbitrary, meaning it is not being applied fairly because not everyone eligible for the death penalty is being sentenced to death and executed. On to the secondary claim, without the death penalty, law firms would lose jobs. The evidence on the fact that people have lost their jobs due to the ban of the death penalty is true. From the case that in Illinois, people lost their jobs. However, this case is the only known case which people have lost their jobs from the ban of the death penalty, and thus is not representative of the effect of the death penalty ban. States like New Mexico and New York, who have also recently abolished the death penalty, which was in 2007 and 2009, did not have any cases in which people at law firms lost their jobs due to the ban of the death penalty. On to my third point. Public opinion of the death penalty is still strong. However, I disagree because while there's still support amongst the public for the death penalty, it is still declining, and people are favoring different ways of justice. According to the deathpenaltyinfo.org, polls are indicating growing support for alternatives to the death penalty, and that capital punishment is ranked the lowest among the budget priorities. On November 16, 2010, the Death Penalty Information Center released the results of one of the most comprehensive studies ever conducted of Americans' views on the death penalty. The national poll of 1,500 registered voters conducted by Lake Research Partners shows support for alternatives to the death penalty. A clear majority, 69%, would choose a person other than the death penalty for murder. A poll by RT Strategies states that because of mistakes and lack of efficacy, the death penalty is losing confidence of the American public. Almost 40% of the U.S. population believes they would be excluded from capital cases, and a majority of 58% believe it is time for a suspension on the death penalty while the process of it goes under federal review. Furthermore, even law enforcement doesn't agree with the death penalty. A Hart research poll of police chiefs in the U.S. found that the majority of the chiefs do not believe the death penalty is an effective law enforcement tool. So I now conclude that the argument presented in favor of the death penalty is weakened due to the lack of evidence and the counterclaims on deterrence of the death penalty and public opinion.
All right. I think that you identified the structure pretty clearly, and you followed the argument on the first point. You did a nice job pointing out the lack of evidence that the advocate had, and then your counterclaim uses a lot of information to support your position, and you contrast that pretty well. I do think from the beginning you do have a presentation issue on credibility issues. You sound a little quiet, a little tired, and you need a little bit more energy and certainty in your voice while you're speaking. Also, your eye contact is a little problematic. There's a lot of reading that's going on. Some of the same problems that we just had in the previous speaker, where there's it comes across more like you're reading an essay rather than you're responding to the argument. Although I think that you did a nice job identifying the arguments you're responding to and providing good counterclaims on most of those points. The data that you had on the state-by-state comparison sounded a little bit old, and the information on the New York statistics was not quite clear. I think there needs to be an explanation of how those numbers were arrived at. The inference that's being drawn there is, of course, about the ineffectiveness of the death penalty. You basically have set up a criteria that says that for the death penalty to work, it has to be, it has to meet these particular conditions, and then you suggest that it can never meet those conditions. And so that's going to be a good standard, except that, like I said, if we had further discussion on this, I'm sure that there would be research that suggests that it has had these kinds of impacts, and it's simply a matter of how you've analyzed the numbers a bit. And at least you've got a criteria that you can come back to and argue about, which I think would help you in a longer debate. On the issue of jobs, I'm not sure how important that one was in the first place. I thought you accepted the description that those people lost jobs. I'm not sure that we should worry about having the death penalty to ensure that people have jobs. That's a value argument to some degree. You make the argument that New York and New Jersey, I think it was, or maybe it was New Mexico, got rid of the death penalty, and they didn't suffer those same kinds of consequences. I think we could use a source citation on that. And then on the declining support for the death penalty, it sounds a lot like some of the information that you're citing is based on budget priorities rather than people's enthusiasm for the death penalty, whether or not it works, except that right at the end there is some discussion about whether or not there are questions about its security, because innocent people are sometimes subjected to a potential threat of death penalty. And then I thought you had an okay job explaining that. The police chief's argument, it's okay. It's like just an extra way of making that particular point. All right, thank you.